Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. My name is John Dewar. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University, and you are most welcome to this evening's event. The reason we're in the State Library is that La Trobe University and the State Library formed a close partnership last year, one consequence of which is that we are able to use this wonderful facility for our public events. And I know that many of you in the audience tonight are here because you're on the State Library mailing list and responded probably to an email that they would have sent you a while ago. Others are connected to La Trobe University and particularly have been following our Ideas in Society programme, of which tonight's event forms a part. And it's with some sadness that I have to acknowledge that Professor Robert Mann, who puts the Ideas in Society programme together, can't be with us this evening. Ordinarily, Rob would be here and would be, in his quiet, scholarly way, asking the most fiendishly difficult questions of our guests this evening. But I'm sure that our guests will do a perfectly good job of doing that to themselves during the course of the evening. The Ideas in Society programme is designed to bring very eminent speakers together around a topic of current significance or interest. And one of the things that Rob seems to do absolutely brilliantly is to identify both the topic and the speaker. And although he's not here tonight, I think he's done it again. In fact, the response to tonight's event has been so overwhelming that we've had to book a second room to accommodate other members of the audience who can't fit in here so that they can watch a live stream of the event. This is, I think, testament to both the interest of the topic and the quality of the speakers we have to discuss it, and I'll introduce them in a very short moment. Of course, the reason we're here is that this month marks the centenary of one of the 20th century's most significant events, the Russian Revolution, which of course led to the eventual rise of the Soviet Union. As I'm sure one of the issues that our discussants will be addressing tonight is the historical legacy of this event and the way it's had an impact in shaping economic and social change, not only in Russia, but around the rest of the globe. And Rob Mann himself has noted, for example, that China and many other political systems with which we're familiar now owe their origins ultimately to this tumultuous event. And we're privileged tonight to hear from two of the country's most distinguished historians. I was going to say distinguished historians on this topic, but actually they're two of our most distinguished historians, full stop, and let me introduce them to you now. Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick is one of the world's most eminent historians of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet experience. She's currently a professor of history at the University of Sydney and a distinguished service professor emerita at the University of Chicago. She's published many well-known books, including Everyday Stalinism and the Russian Revolution, and her most recent book, called On Stalin's Team, won the 2016 Prime Minister's Prize for Non-Fiction. And Sheila tells me she has yet another book coming out later this year called Mishka's War, expected around about July, published by Melbourne University Press. Professor Mark Edele was born in Bavaria and obtained his doctorate from the University of Chicago. Now you might notice that there's a connection here between these two guests and the University of Chicago, and the nature of that connection is that Mark was a PhD student of Sheila's at the University of Chicago. So they've known each other now for probably well over 20 years, and I think they know each other's work pretty well. Mark is currently a professor of history at the University of Western Australia, but he's finally seen the light and has decided to move to Melbourne, and will begin his tenure as the inaugural Hansen Chair in History, a very handsomely endowed chair, he says rather enviously, at the University of Melbourne in July of this year, probably around about the same time Sheila's book gets published. Mark is a specialist in the history of the Soviet Union during and after the Second World War, and his books include Stalinist Society, 1928 to 1953, Soviet Veterans of the Second World War, and his new book, Stalin's Defectors, How Red Army Soldiers Became Hitler's Collaborators. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professors Sheila Fitzpatrick and Mark Edele. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this introduction. I just want to remind you why we're here, although you all know why we're here. 100 years ago, on the 23rd of February 1917, revolution broke out in Petrograd, the former Petersburg, the latest Leningrad, and today again St. Petersburg. Or actually it didn't, because the 23rd of February in the then Russian calendar is the 8th of March in the Gregorian calendar, which we use and which the West used at the time. So we're actually ahead of time here. It's really the 8th of March when this happens. And that's important because the 8th of March is International Women's Day, and that triggered the revolution. So it was women demonstration, women workers who were celebrating International Women's Day, but were also protesting against food rationing, bread rationing in particular. The supply crisis, which had to do with the war, with the overtaxing of the train system, sort of came to a head. Very soon they were joined by male workers as well, who were striking in the industrial districts of Petrograd, and soon all of this escalated into a general strike. Tsar Nicholas II, in his wisdom, ordered shooting on the demonstrators. That had triggered a revolution before in 1905. This time, very soon, troops went over to the revolutionaries, and by the 27th of February, that is our 12th of March, the revolution controlled the city. Now, demands for the Tsar to abdicate came not only from the streets, but increasingly from the political elite as well. The once loyal opposition in the Duma, the parliament which had been, or the pseudo-parliament many say, which had been one of the results of the first revolution of 1905, demanded the Tsar abdicate, but also now government ministers and even the military high command. So on the 2nd of March, the 12th of March in our time, the Tsar complied, and the Romanov dynasty ended in Russia. So this is the immediate thing we're commemorating today, the so-called February Revolution, but that was only the first step. As you will be well aware, the revolutionary situation continued, the war continued, the new government, the provisional government, which was run by liberals and moderate socialists, wanted to continue the war against Germany, with the democratic world, as they put it, and that was incredibly unpopular. The war went from bad to worse, and by October, or November, a new revolutionary crisis culminated in the takeover of power by the Bolshevik Party around Lenin. So that's the October Revolution, which is now November, to make things confusing. And that was the second step of a escalation which led to a terribly destructive civil war, breakdown of the empire into a large number of independently governed and very often not governed territories, and a very destructive civil war, actually a cluster of civil wars, which the Bolsheviks won in the end by 1922. They had reconquered, the Red Army had reconquered a lot of the old Romanov empire, with the exception of Finland, the exception of the Baltic republics, and the exception of Poland. So a smaller, but still fairly similar empire to the late Romanov. So that is the immediate end of the first big revolutionary crisis, but we'll talk later about today whether or not some historians continue to think about the revolution continuing after that, including Sheila, in fact. And that gets me now to ask my first question, because I will be asking the questions and Sheila will answer them, hopefully.
Unless I feel like throwing them back to you.
That's right, yes. And, but you're the revolutionary specialist, not me. So the first sort of fairly open question, I think, is we're now 100 years from the revolution. From this vantage point of today, how important would you say was the revolution, the Russian Revolution, for the history of the 20th century? Would you see it as a turning point? How important would you evaluate?
Well, up to 1991, it seemed like a tremendous turning point. It was the central event for many historians. For example, in Eric Hobsbawm's history of the short 20th century, it's right there in the middle of it. Why it seemed such an enormous turning point then was that the impact throughout the world was very great. Of course, it was negative in many cases, but a considerable fear that this revolutionary wave would go further, and the development of very strong, small but strong groups of supporters. But then, after the Second World War in particular, you had the spread of communist regimes, Leninist-inspired regimes, through large parts of the globe, Eastern Europe, China, of course, from 1949, and a range of countries in Asia. And so up to the time of 1989-91, that is up to the time of the great collapse of the Soviet Union and many of those communist states, it seemed as if this was a wave of the future that everybody had to take account of. So now we're in an interesting moment, post-91. Now what do we think of it? Now that because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think there's a certain, that conveys a sense of failure, right? I mean, whatever that wave of history was, it seems to have broken and dispersed. So I think that now we, that is to say scholars in the field, are a bit perplexed about what to think of it. You can of course approach the legacy in different ways. You could say, as people have said of the French Revolution, it leaves us a set of ideas that are of enormous importance for liberty, equality, fraternity in the case of the French Revolution. But what exactly you say, I have the feeling I may have lost. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it's just a sort of a strange change in the pressure in my ears or something. Anyway, so with regard to the French Revolution, we can feel that has left us this enormous legacy. With regard to the Russian Revolution, what would we say? Has it left us a legacy of ideas about socialism or state socialism? Has it left us anything like an example? Perhaps we'll come back to this question, but people are, I think, quite hesitant to make big claims along those lines.
Unless they say that it was a negative example, and we have
negative example, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, negative example. We have many people saying that. Yeah.
So that actually leads to the second question as well, the set of ideas, because it has inspired, as you mentioned, it has inspired socialists, radicals of various sorts, progressives in both the West, but also in the decolonizing world for decades. And when do you think this big hope, which the revolution embodied for many people, of a non-capitalist, more egalitarian socialist society, or actually communism, right? If which was always on the horizon and one never got there. When do you think that hope died in sort of left-wing circles around the globe, or is it still there?
Well, Yeah, it's hard to say when it died, isn't it? I mean, it's certainly around after the war. Then comes along the competition with China, especially after the Soviet Union and China, after the Sino-Soviet split. But it seems to me that the notion of the example, perhaps it was diminishing through the 70s and the 80s, but I think it was a collapse of the Soviet Union that stopped people in their tracks and made the whole thing look different, because one had seen it as something going towards a future of some kind, whether or not you liked it, and suddenly it wasn't.
And 1956, the secret speech, also probably
made
some difference.
Yes, of course. I mean, you have a phenomenon, if one's thinking of the left in particular, yes, a phenomenon of people dropping off, and 56, where in 56 you have both Khrushchev's speech, in which he talks about Stalin's crimes, though he doesn't repudiate everything about the Stalin era, as well he might not do, as he was a member of Stalin's team. That's the subject of that book that was mentioned. But it's also the Hungarian Revolution, which was put down by Soviet troops. Revolution in Poland also put down, and so a lot of disillusionment then. But some people held on.
How important do you think it was for Australia, for Australian politics, both the on the left as an inspiration, but also as a sort of a specter and a threat for the for people outside of the left?
I think we have to throw. I was away from Australia for so many years that I feel as if I am not an expert on that. I mean, I'm okay on Australian politics up to 1964, and then from 2012. So, but what happens in between, everybody in the audience will know better than me. So perhaps we in the question period we can come to that one.
Okay. If we shift now from Australia and the West and the impact to contemporary Russia and the role of the revolution in the thinking and also the speaking about the past of the current government, we've both written about quite the obsession of the current government in Russia, the Putin government, and Putin himself with history. And with a positive history of the nation. Mostly this is about the Second World War and the victory over fascism, the victory over National Socialism, winning the war in Europe, and saving the world from a dark fascist past. But there's also the revolution now, and they'll have to deal with the revolution in some way. So how do you think the Putin government and the historian-in-chief Vladimir Putin himself are dealing with the revolution?
I think it's a tremendous embarrassment to have this centenary because they don't know whether they like the revolution or they don't like it. And if they like it, they're not sure which part of it they like. So I think Putin must be, privately wishing if only it hadn't happened, if only it could be 20 years down the road when we'd worked out what we thought about the revolution. They were, as you know, they were enormously late getting anything started. Putin made an announcement that we will celebrate the revolutions. He didn't say exactly the revolution, he didn't say which one. And he made that announcement in, I think it was December 21st, 2016. That was just a month or 2 months before before February was coming up. He then said the detailed instructions about the kind of celebration of the centenary would be coming out in mid-January. Nothing. And his culture minister, who has been very active there, made all sorts of speeches about things that were going to happen. But I think some of the things he wanted to happen, maybe Putin is not so keen on. I find it completely extraordinary the sort of lack of action on the Russian part, because everybody else, that is all over the world, scholars, are having conferences. Scholars love to have conferences, and so if a centenary comes up, there are conferences, from Sweden to Santiago to Texas, everywhere. So my whole year is conferences at various places, and I was thinking, what's wrong? The Russians are not inviting me. And there was one invitation on the February Revolution. Is absolutely not my thing. But anyway, they did invite me to that one. And that was the only one I'd heard of. That was a Leningrad one. Then, it must be now 3 weeks ago, I got this official invitation from the Russian Historical Society, of which the president is the Minister for Culture, who is Putin's main organization man, about having a conference in October, very, very late to organize a conference in Moscow on the Russian Revolution. So I eagerly looked to see, well, what kind of spin are they giving it? They're not giving it any spin. In other words, they're treating it as this is exactly what Putin said. Putin said, when he finally spoke about celebrating it, he said, we need deep, professional, objective discussion. So nothing on the streets, nothing involving politics, just the scholars can have a conversation about it. And that's what this conference is. It's got headings like revolution and violence. In other words, exactly what if if the Harry Guggenheim Foundation had organized this, it would have the same headings. So absolutely no hint of what the Russians want celebrated. Now, we do have some hints because Medinsky has made these many speeches, the Minister of Culture. And what he says, his take is that it's sort of, we're not pro-red, we're not pro-white, but he's a bit more anti-red. I think, not Putin, but he is. But basically he says, we don't want to be partisan about these fights from long ago. We don't want to take any side. We want to recognize how everybody suffered on every side. No doubt the people who fought on both sides, they had great ideals, but it was all,
But in the end, he comes down on the side of the Bolsheviks because they win and build the state, right? While
Putin
whites
does. I don't know,
No, Medinsky does, yeah.
Well, okay. But then their big thing is, so the way we're going to celebrate is to think about reconciliation. Reconciliation of reds and whites, communists and anti-communists, the West and the East, you name it, we're going to reconcile, and Russia and the Ukraine. And one plan was to build some kind of monument to reconciliation. You remember the French on the the centenary of their revolution, they built the Eiffel Tower. So there was a thought that the Russians ought to build something, and this should be some kind of monument to reconciliation, be built down in the Crimea. And the opening date is November 2017. Now, as of now, they have announced that they're thinking of this. They haven't budgeted for it. They haven't decided what city it would be in. They've called for a design competition without, as far as I can see, an end date. Anyway, they haven't awarded it. Well, of course, how could you design a monument if you don't know where it's going to be? So, my sense is, maybe you have something more recent on that, but my sense was that proposal had got stuck. And, I mean, the Crimea is a bit of an iffy place to put...
Good. Now, the question of whether or not this revolution was a revolution or something else is one of the questions I wanted to ask you. To come back to sort of also the debate among scholars, which you were involved in as well. As far as I can tell, nobody disputes that the February Revolution was a revolution, right? Everybody seems to agree that it was one. But October, there's this question of whether or not it was a revolution or a coup. And that used to be a very partisan debate. So I wondered what your take at the moment is on this old debate about was it a revolution or was it a coup? So was it, in other words, a legitimate revolution, or was this an illegitimate takeover by the Bolsheviks?
Yeah, well, that was that one about was it a coup or was it a revolution, which took place in the late 60s. This is Cold War times. It was basically in the US, the debate mainly. And the context was that American Soviet studies at that time was very anti-Soviet. I mean, you were studying the Soviet Union to know your enemy very, very definitely. And the notion that the Soviet regime and therefore the revolution that produced it were illegitimate, they were very strong. Now, and also there was a focus very much on the politics, the whole political dimension, not the social dimension of the revolution. So there came along a bunch of social historians trying to do social history of 1917 for the first time, American social historians.
You were among them.
Well, no, I wasn't doing 1917, but I was one of the ones. They were called revisionists, and I was called a revisionist, but I did revisionism. What I was revising was a bit later, but they were revising this. And so they wanted to say, look, it wasn't just some politically motivated men taking power. There were people out on the streets there. There was major social support, including for the Bolshevik Party. So that was the nature of that argument. To me, I mean, I feel as if the terms you use mainly just convey whether you want to say it's legitimate or not. In other words, they're value-laden. So if you want, revolution is a good term. I don't know quite why, because I'm actually a bit doubtful about revolution. But in any case, whereas coup d'etat indicates illegitimacy. So if your political line is that you want to emphasize the illegitimacy, then you'll call it a coup d'etat. But about February, by the way, I think people just call that a revolution because they're not interested in it. I mean, the reason there isn't an argument, because after all, it was, okay, there are people out in the streets, but there are people out in the streets in October too. But the actual setting up of the provisional government, which is the outcome of February, that is a deal done among old elites. So I don't see why that's
not a coup d'etat.
That's more legit. I mean, the Allies recognized that government. In that sense, it's more legitimate. They recognized it because they thought it was going to go on fighting the war. Russia was on the Western side, so.
And it did.
And it did.
And that broke its neck.
And it did. It broke its neck. Yes.
So in historical terms, can you talk a little bit about the nature of Bolshevik support on the street in October, in the cities, in the villages?
The Bolsheviks saw themselves as a party of the working class. And of course, before the revolution, when most of their leaders were intellectuals in emigration, that was a fairly dubious claim. There were other competitors, by the way, other revolutionary parties, but none of the revolutionary parties had big support, except perhaps for the SRs, which had a lot of peasant support. Now, in 1917, when the old regime falls and revolutionaries return, Lenin among them on the sealed train, but Trotsky, everybody's returning, and you have people coming, as you described, coming out on the streets in February, and they more or less stay milling around more and more as the months pass. And this particularly in the capital, which at that point is Petrograd, also known as St. Petersburg, also known as Leningrad, but at this point Petrograd, which is the capital, and they're also on the streets in Moscow. Now, as the months pass and Russia continues to fight and lose people at the front, and the food situation continues to deteriorate, and the peasants start getting really agitated about taking the land, so the popularity of radical parties increases. The most radical of the parties, including of the socialist parties, was the Bolshevik Party. And it was the most radical because it was the intransigent one. Lenin was the one leader of the socialists who said, we're not going to cooperate with the liberals, we're not going to cooperate with anybody, we're going to make our own revolution. Now, as the provisional government status deteriorates, so more and more support for the Bolsheviks. Now, in the July days, you have crowds of workers coming out in their hundreds of thousands on the street and basically calling on the Bolsheviks to take power. And also sailors coming down from Kronstadt out calling on them to take power, and they don't.
And they get insulted by the crowds.
Yes. So they didn't have the nerve, actually, at that point. But that indicates the kind of popular support they had at that moment in the big cities. Now, out in the countryside, people don't know very much about the Bolsheviks. They get to know, unless they're on the railway lines, the knowledge of the Bolsheviks and also support for the Bolsheviks is greater along all the main railway lines. But insofar as the Bolshevik program sanctioned the peasants taking the land, which was the peasants' single issue cause, you can say they're not pro-Bolshevik, but they might be if they knew who they were. Now, we do have actually one index of popular opinion, which is that there had been a proposal with the provisional government after the February Revolution that they'd call a constituent assembly, in other words, a constitutional convention to decide what will be the future governance of Russia. And those elections are held actually after the Bolsheviks have taken power, but the Bolsheviks let them go ahead. And the Bolsheviks get about a quarter of the vote nationally, which I've always thought was very, very high, given that they're primarily an urban party. They wipe out all the other Marxist socialist parties. But the best polling party is another socialist party, the peasant-oriented socialist party.
If we return to the origins of the revolution, I mentioned at the beginning the importance of the food crisis, which was triggered by the war, which has become, and the war has sort of grown in importance, the First World War, in recent historiography about the revolution. So the old Soviet view was that the revolution was historically inevitable. It was a social revolution which was driven by the contradictions of capitalism emerging in Russia, and the war was sort of not very important for this narrative. It did happen, obviously, the war, but it was not at the forefront of the explanation. Emigre scholars, on the other hand, and some of the earliest historians of the revolution in the United States were emigres. They blamed the strains of the war on the revolution. So there was a whole school of thought that basically a liberal society was emerging before 1914, and were it not for this terrible war, no revolution would have happened. And this view has sort of gained, in Western historiography, has gained some power recently. There's more and more work on the public sphere and politics in the pre-1914 period. And then there are historians who embed the revolution into a wider continuum of crisis, which includes the war, the revolution or the revolutions, and the civil war in one big violent sort of maelstrom. And the revolution nearly disappears in this narrative as a distinctive event. So I was interested in your reaction to this literature. I mean, some of your students are among this crowd, and how do you think that narrative changes the position of the revolution in sort of a big image of the Second World War, a la Hobsbawm?
The First World War.
The First World War, yes. Yeah. Did I say Second World War? It's because I'm obsessed with the First World War.
No, it was a very strange situation, especially in the way the Soviets told their history. There is 1917, it's this huge event, and the war just disappeared. So that their study of the First World War was minimal compared to everybody else. I mean, in every other country, the French have huge, the Germans, the British, we have. but not the Russians, because the revolution had overshadowed it. And Western historiography mirrored that to an extent. I mean, you look at just how many books are there on Russia and the war, and it's rather a small section in the libraries compared to anybody else's section. So it was extremely good when the war was rediscovered, because, I mean, it was just as big a thing in Russia as it was anywhere else. It's just that not only did the history suppress it, but if you looked at the way people told their own life stories in the Soviet period, they sort of glossed over the war. It was, you know, I was called up and then I met some Bolsheviks and then the revolution happened and then my post-revolutionary life began. So that was a real example of historical amnesia, which needed to be corrected. Now, corrections always, after a while, require more corrections. So that is certainly true. Now, on the other end, the Civil War, which goes from 1918 to about 2021 in most parts, in the central part, that, of course, always should be, at least, I mean, it seems to me that it's absolutely clear, because it's not, okay, in October or November, whichever you want to say, the Bolsheviks say, they seize power and they say, now we're in charge, but they're not in charge until they have sort of squashed the opposition, as they themselves realize. So that comes at the end of the Civil War, so I think that that's also a very healthy development.
So what do you think does that, if the war comes back as an important part of the story and the revolution gets smaller, does that change sort of the story of the 20th century, in which you know, the Russian Revolution was one of the major turning points, while in that newer literature it sort of disappears as a turning point, as just one moment.
That's what I meant, that there probably needs a correction to the correction.
Right.
Because I don't see that it detracts. I mean, it changes the way you tell the story of the Great War in Europe. If you add back Russia, it certainly changes that. But I don't see that it changes, for example, take the Hobsbawm picture, that the Russian Revolution is absolutely central to creating the 20th century. I don't see that it changes that.
Mm-hmm. So if we now go to the other end of the revolutionary life cycle, when it ends. So far we've talked about 1920, 21, 22, depending where you are in the empire, as the end point. But in your own book on the revolution does not end there, but it ends deep in Stalinism. And there's a change between the first edition from 1982, where the revolution ends with Stalin's revolution from above, so 1928-32, the first five-year plan, collectivization, decolonization, and an onslaught on old elites. So a new revolutionary moment, and after that, there's basically a new state sort of in being. But in the second edition, in 1994, you pushed the revolution further on, and the Great Terror of 37-38 becomes a central part, or the end point of the revolution, which was there in the first edition as a postscript, but was not a central part of the narrative. So I was curious what changed your mind and why you shifted, why you took the Great Terror in.
You left out the bit about irritating everybody else, everybody on both sides. Anyway.
I will ask you that question too.
You're going to ask me that question. Okay, well, I mean, the thing is, you know, when you read about revolution in the history books, there is this suggestion that we can know exactly when, that the revolution is a thing like the birth of a person and the death of a person, that we could be in some way certain about beginning and ends, but it isn't so at all. I mean, the revolution is, in a sense, what we think is the relevant upheaval. And so depending on your understanding of the revolution, you're going to expand or contract it accordingly. And if you look at the beginning point of where people begin, you know, some people begin in 1905, other people, does FI just begin in 1894 or something? so strange times that people start. But anyway, where they start, so they begin at various times when they see the social fabric or the political fabric disintegrating. Now, where you end it is presumably when you think that whatever this upheaval is has run its course. So as I looked at it, now the first thing to decide is it finished at the end of the Civil War? It would be, the Bolsheviks have won, the Reds are in control. Is it finished then? Now, it seemed to me, no, because you have just about 8 years of sort of treading water, and then along comes Stalin, Lenin dies, Stalin comes in, and he says, now, we had the political revolution, we got power, but our whole point was to change the economic structure because that's what Marxists believe is necessary for revolution, and we haven't done that. We haven't nationalized, we haven't collectivized agriculture. So until we do that, we haven't done part 2 of the revolution. And so you have, at the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 30s, what's been called Stalin's revolution from above. Now, this does not involve people on the streets. So in that sense, it doesn't belong to the revolution as a social upheaval. But if you're talking about a transformation that started, in my mind, in 1917, then it seemed to me that you have to include it. So okay, so that was when I was writing. The book initially, I thought I've got to include it. But it kept niggling away at me, what about the purges at the end of the 1930s? Those purges have, this is sort of mass killing of a random type in the midst of a moral panic. It's got a revolutionary feel to me. I mean, if you have killing for no very clear purpose, but in order to maintain something which is described as purity of the revolution. So it looks to me like a revolutionary event. And also, I think I was very strongly brought up on the French Revolution as the model. Mm-hmm. And in the French Revolution, if you remember, you have the sort of the more peaceful phase at 1789, and then it goes more and more radical, and it ends up with the terror of 1794, followed by Thermidor, the collapse. And then followed by Napoleon. So they can have their arguments about whether Napoleon is in or not. But nobody says of the French Revolution, let's not have 1794 and the terror. It's the revolutionary terror. So I thought same thing should apply here. However, here comes the question of sort of where you stand in factional struggles. I didn't make this decision to please any particular faction in Sovietology, but I was aware that if I include the purges in the sort of lefty types who were the revisionists, probably won't like it. So in that first edition, I had it in, but I had it as a question mark, if I remember. In other words, I wasn't definite about the purges being a part of the whole revolutionary process.
You weren't ready to annoy the fellow revisionists too much.
Well, but I quite quickly, I think I became ready to annoy them, as well as the other ones. Right, and actually, as my thinking went on, I guess I think somewhere you refer to my taking 1939 as the end of the revolution. Well, that's just I don't take that date except insofar as that is the end of the purges. But if I look at Russian history, the sort of scope of the longue durée of Soviet history, what I observe is that Russia goes into the war more or less still thinking of itself as a revolutionary society and polity, and it comes out of the war having forgotten this totally. It's done, it's finished. They don't, of course, repudiate the revolution. But what happens after the Second World War is that the founding event of the great Soviet nation becomes victory in the Second World War. So the revolution is an earlier founding event, but it's been downgraded.
Which is also the founding event of modern Russia now, under the current government. So 39-40 is the other question, which you basically already answered, and that is when, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Soviets take over parts of Poland, and then the Baltic states. That also has been called a revolution from above, and in many ways it's sort of an extension of what has happened in the Soviet Union proper onto these new. So
Well,
one
of
could
course you
see
can-
that as part of the
You can make that
revolutionary-
argument, but my sense is that means if you have a picture that the next part of the Russian Revolution is its expansion outwards after the Second World War. That's not part of my picture, in a sense, because I see post-war Russia as far as within the country, so strongly non-revolution, the revolution having become a historical event. Now, they are, of course, quite different in their attitude to the Eastern European regimes that they're sort of trying to set up in their own image. And that's very interesting. Things like back in the day, in the revolutionary day in the Soviet Union, they practiced affirmative action on behalf of the working class because they'd taken power on behalf of the workers. Well, that was a necessary, in their view, revolutionary transformation, but they stopped doing it in the mid-1930s. But in the post-war period, when they're recommending policies to Eastern Europe, they say have some affirmative action on behalf of the workers and get rid of the bourgeoisie. So in other words, they can have revolution, but we no longer have revolution.
Yeah, I want to come back to the question of irritating everybody on both factions, because one of the, I think what was behind that irritation as well was the question about when the revolution ends is also a question about the continuities and discontinuities between Leninism and Stalinism, right? And there were a lot of people in the academic left who were, Leninists of some sort, but were not Stalinists. And so for them, the Trotsky's notion that there was a river of blood separating Leninism from Stalinism was quite essential to telling the story. And now you were seen, I think, both by people within the sort of new social history of the Soviet Union, but also in particular from people outside, so the older generation of totalitarian scholars and pundits in the American public sphere in particular, as part of this revisionist left-wing group. And there you come and write a book which basically says Stalinism is part of the revolution. There's no rivers of blood separating the two. And so I was wondering to what extent you consciously try to irritate both sides, because they were irritated, both sides.
Well, I was always the totalitarian people who I was conscious of combating, because they were basically saying, in my view, that you only want to look at the politics. Nothing happens in the Soviet Union that isn't decided from the top. There is therefore no social history. I thought this is absurd because, they try to decide things from the top, but it doesn't work. That was my view. But with regard to irritating the other revisionists, I was myself irritated by them because they're saying they really were very, what I saw as whitewashing Lenin and the revolution, in the sense that they were saying all this violence is Stalin, all this rivers of blood. Well, I mean, the rivers of blood in the Civil War too, and Trotsky is of course one of the people involved in shedding them, and Lenin too. And we probably have now a better picture of that since the opening of the archives. Now, you can say there's a change in the nature of the killing and whatever, but it wasn't only that I saw a continuity in the violence. I saw a continuity in that I thought Stalin was trying to complete Lenin's revolution, like it or not. But
that's
there
what he said.
Yeah, no, he said he was, and I thought he was. But I didn't, in the course of writing that book on the Russian Revolution, I realized that I really didn't like revolutions, that I think what happens in revolutions is that you have people putting out sort of great, good-sounding slogans about liberty or social or equality or whatever, but what they do is call forth the base passions, and what people can do in revolutions is to take revenge on the people that they've resented all along or envied, and that's what they do. So there's an awful lot of there are tremendous costs of taking away those normal constraints and saying it's okay to attack the enemies, whoever you think the enemies So I had really I came to a rather negative view of revolution.
Which really surprised some on the totalitarian side, right? Because they had made up their mind that you're part of the enemy, and then Richard Pipes in particular, who very nicely wrote in a review that this was an extremely unrevisionist book, this book which this Fitzpatrick woman has written there. So he was very...
Yes, well,
really
people do feel you should live up to your reputation. And if you're meant to be a revisionist, well, be a revisionist. Right. That's what they felt.
We're now 100 years away from this revolution, and earlier in the last century, in 1978 actually, the French historian François Furet famously declared the French Revolution finished, terminé. And I was wondering if 100 years since the revolution, if it is finished too, in terms of being an extremely important part of the history of the present.
Mm-hmm. I think it seems to be sort of more or less finished for us. I can't imagine writing like Hobsbawm about it anymore, although I can easily imagine having done it back then. But I don't think it's finished for the Russians, because insofar as as Putin is trying to work out, is he pro or con? And actually he has he made those interesting comments down in the South about how, he'd been a party member and he hadn't thrown away his party card, and lots of things about the Soviet Union he liked, and he still liked, he said, and socialism seems like a good thing, many socialist ideas. And then he has that very strange divergence into saying, but why did they have to kill not only the Tsar's family, which he doesn't mind so much, but the Tsar's personal physician and his dogs, and also his servants. I mean, it's a strange, but
and clergy. I mean, that's the other thing. The anti-church.
Yes. Why did they have to be anti-church?
Doesn't work so well. Do historians still worry about the revolution? I mean, there's some worry clearly about in Russia today, just because it's 100 years anniversary, but
I don't think so. I mean, I think what seems to me, if you look at what's been going on in the historiography, the continuum of crisis is a good example, the one that brought back the First World War. All the new directions have been pointing to things that were overlooked when you had a teleology leading to revolution. There was, I used to teach at Columbia University in New York, and there, the person who taught the late imperial period, in other words, just before the revolution, he called his subject the pre-revolution. In other words, what was important in the late imperial period were the things that led to the revolution, the things that could explain to you why the revolution happened. So that meant that all sorts of things like the history of the church, for example, not interesting at all, because they didn't explain why the revolution happened. So lots of current work is doing that, is looking at the things that you didn't look at if you were thinking in terms of a revolutionary teleology.
Which really means that the revolution as a subject of study is finished in a certain way, isn't it?
Unless, well, I mean, you have Yuri Slyozkin coming with a book that's coming out later this year, which is basically going back to that old idea of Bolshevism as a religion, and there's a millenarian religion, and it's I mean, I've never been sympathetic to it, but it's powerfully argued, and I think that may be the bit. The next big idea, so to speak, in the scholarship, partly because at the moment we're interested in millenarian revolutions. I mean, it feels relevant, whereas socialist revolutions to most people probably just doesn't feel relevant.
And in terms of archival research on the revolution, do you think there's still anything to uncover for historians?
Well, there's always more archives, but the 1917 archives have been fairly accessible for a fairly long time. What happened in the 90s and onwards was that people started mining provincial archives more thoroughly. Now, we couldn't it was difficult for us in the old days. We were very constrained in what we could do, and we couldn't go out to the provinces. So there were all those books on essentially everyday life in the revolution and civil war in Perm, in Vladivostok or wherever. So that's, that's going on.
That's happening. My final question before we open the floor to questions from the audience, is about your own book on the revolution, which came out 35 years ago. And a fellow doctoral student at the University of Chicago once told me that it was this book which made him wanting to be a historian. So you have a lot to answer for, I think. But it's, I think, indicative for how influential this book was in the historiography of, and also in the teaching of the Russian Revolution. It has gone through 3 editions now. Each of them was not just a new edition, but an actually revised edition. And I was wondering if there's going to be a 4th revised edition of Sheila Fitzpatrick's The Russian Revolution.
Well, there is, yes, a 4th edition, which I've done it, and Oxford is sort of, I think you told me that it's going to come out in September. Anyway,
yes, that's
but
what
it's
they
going.
told us, yes.
I hope they can get themselves organised enough to get it out in 2017. I mean, it's funny with that book. I wrote that book in 1979 in Canberra, and it was I was out there with and I decided I'd write it without any books, because there weren't very many books there to write it with. So I wrote it out of my head and then sort of checked it. It was it seemed to me so long ago. It was the first time I'd come back to Australia after leaving in 1964. Mm-hmm. So it was a very, but that's a terrible long, I feel I had a whole life after that. So naturally, when I read this book, it's in a way a book written by somebody else. It's not that I disagree with it. I think it's a good, I think it's a good book, and it tells the story very clearly and all that, but probably now I wouldn't tell it in quite the same way. But, so you say the editions were basically revised. I mean, they weren't really. The text, other than the last chapter was revised for the second edition, and every time I revised the introduction and conclusion in the bibliography. Now, after the second or the third edition, that was great, because the Soviet Union had just collapsed. And it was really interesting to think, well, how does that change one's view of the revolution? Because up to that time, we had thought that was like the American Revolution, in other words, a nation-founding revolution, and suddenly it isn't. And so how does that affect your feeling about it? So that was interesting. This time, I more or less, I said, well, it's a centenary, and we're not sure if it's important or not. But of course, I couldn't say that too much, because people, I mean, it's set in year 12. One wants people to keep on reading it.
So is there anything different other than an introduction?
No, not really. I mean, the reading is the reading and some of the references are updated. Oh, and the other thing that's new is that for the first time it's being translated into Russian for publication there.
So is that coming out also this year?
That must be out. I mean, the Russians never tell you anything like when is it coming out, but I believe it's coming out in the next few months.
Right. Because many of your other books have been translated.
No, the other ones were translated. Most of the other ones were translated, in the 90s and
but
2000.
Not the revolution. Thank you very much. I think we open the floor now. There are 2 microphones going around, so if you could raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we will direct somebody with a microphone. So please.
Thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick. Sorry. Over this way.
Thank
you very much. Very interesting speech. My name is Patrick O'Connor. I actually write for the World Socials website. Obviously, we have certain political disagreements on the question of revolution. It's interesting to me to hear such a vehement opponent of revolution from a historian such as yourself, given that if it weren't for the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, we would likely all be living under autocracy. Perhaps you'd care to speak about that. But specifically, I would like to ask a question about the opposition to Stalin and the bureaucracy raised by Leon Trotsky and the left opposition in 1923, which you skipped over in your remarks. There was a clear difference of political perspective between Stalin's and Bukharin's perspective of socialism in one country versus Trotsky's permanent revolution. That is the notion upon which the October Revolution was based, that to be successful, a socialist society couldn't possibly be established in one country, let alone a country as economically backward as Russia and the Soviet Union. And it had to be extended into Germany, Italy, United States, and so on. So I was hoping you could speak about your assessment 100 years after the revolution of the political relevance of Trotsky and perhaps the target of the purges, which in my view was a counter-revolutionary bloodbath. It wasn't an extension or part of the revolution, it was in fact its antithesis. Thank you.
Well, let me address that question of the argument about socialism in one country. Everybody initially, in all the Russian revolutionaries, anticipated, expected, hoped, etc., that they would be part of an international revolution, and they indeed thought that Germany, as the more developed country, would take the lead. And then that didn't happen. So what are you going to do? You have already taken power. Now you could go back and say to the electorate, so to speak, okay, we resigned power because we thought we were part of an international revolution and it's collapsed everywhere else, so we won't have power anymore. But, that's an impossible, one cannot imagine any government behaving like that. And that includes a government had Trotsky been leading it. A lot of the argument in which Trotsky accuses Stalin of being for socialism in one country, and Stalin accuses Trotsky of being an internationalist who doesn't care about Russia. I mean, this is all polemical rhetoric, or a great part of it, because the thing is that there's only one country in which they have the opportunity of building what they call socialism. There isn't another option unless somebody else has a revolution.
Do you want to comment on the Great Terror as a counter-revolutionary bloodbath?
It's a point of view, not mine.
There was, I think, a hand up in front somewhere? No? No? Do we have other questions?
There's one here.
There's two here, and there's, yeah, please.
Thank you, Ms. Fitzpatrick, for coming down. Hello. I'm currently studying your work for Year 12 VCE in Russian revolutions, and I'm really enjoying it. One of the questions we were asked is, at what point was the Russian Revolution inevitable?
Well, I don't really believe in inevitability in history. I mean, this is a very in Soviet history. It's always a much discussed thing because the Marxist sense involves a sense of necessary progressions. In other words, you in the direction of a socialist revolution. And I don't hold. That's not my intellectual framework. So I don't hold that view. But also, as a historian, I rather strongly feel that it's in the nature of historical explanation to suggest that things were inevitable. In other words, we explain why they happen, and that simply offering that explanation makes it look as if it had to happen that way. But I don't think this is so at all. Nor do I think it's a matter that you have big dividing points. It can go this way, it can go that way. I think at every moment things can go a bit different. And here I sort of draw on chaos theory, which I probably don't really understand. But in any case, my sense is that when we impose notions of inevitability on history, this is an unfortunate byproduct of explanation in itself.
And that's also an answer to the question about the turning point, right? I've been asked to speak later this year on whether or not the Russian Revolution was a turning point in history, and the obvious answer is yes, right? But then pretty much every moment is a...
Yes, every moment is... But I don't mind calling it a turning point. But that's retrospective. Yeah.
I think we had two questions in the middle, and then here.
Sheila, David Beecham. At the time of the revolution, the church was part of the establishment, and as I understand it, after the revolution, the church was very much downgraded. Now the church again seems to be closely linked to the state. Is this another indication that the revolution is truly over?
Yes, I think that is indeed, and yes, it's one of those quite neat sort of back to where we were before 1917 kind of situations. And the you were talking about Putin's concern about the way the revolution went against the church, and that's quite if you look at it, you can say, why did the Bolsheviks go so much against the church? It made it much harder to deal with the peasants and so on. A rational calculation would have made them less anti-church than they were. But the thing is that when you joined the Bolshevik Party, you thought you were there's a bunch of ideas that were extremely important to the people in it, and anti-church, anti-religion, but the notion that we, through science, have seen that religion is is the opium of the people or whatever. That was very strong in the party. So that so embedded in the political culture. I don't know that they really had a choice.
Here is a question, and I'm trying to remember. I have two there. Yes.
Hi Sheila, I'm Marianne Hicks, and Mark once said something that I thought was really interesting and takes us back to the previous question. He said that the structure of narrative is one way that we construct our argument. And thinking about your book, The Russian Revolution, if it was no longer in existence and you were to retell it, how would you restructure it? How would it change being the 35 years that you've lived since then and the work that you've done?
Well, I'd have to write the book to tell you. I know, I know that I know it would be different. I think it wouldn't be. It's rather cut and dried, It's got, and that's partly why I think it's quite a good book to teach from. It has revolution accomplished, revolution betrayed. That's nicely set up against each other. I probably wouldn't do that. No, but I just don't know what I would do, because it's not a thing. You don't, when you've written a book on something, you don't really go back and think, or I don't, how would I write it differently, unless you actually sit down and start writing another book.
There was a question in the middle here, and then in the back.
Hi, Sheila. You mentioned at the start of the talk, or you touched on something that I found really interesting, the question of the ideas that perhaps were embodied in the Russian Revolution. Do you think, now looking at it, that any of those ideas themselves were worth celebrating, or are worth celebrating now, or are worth taking forward?
Yeah, well, the ideas involved in socialism, which of course there are many, but the notion that huge disparities of wealth are unacceptable, and that there should be some kind of redistribution, I think I'm sympathetic to that, and many people are. Now the question is, where with the Russian Revolution people have problems is that their notion was that redistribution, which of course they didn't fully do, but never mind, that redistribution must be done by the state. And we have gone very much away from the notion that problems can be best solved by the state. Now, I probably still have some feeling that that some things should be solved by the state. But the Soviet example, of course, is a very depressing one if you think like that. Not only because problems were not solved, but because of the huge and incompetent bureaucracy that was created to carry out those policies.
Robert in the back.
Thanks. I'm Robert Horvath from La Trobe University. Thank you both for a fascinating presentation. My question concerns your observations regarding the relatively equivocal stance of the Putin regime towards the legacy of the revolution, both in terms of rhetoric about reconciliation and in terms of Medinsky's unwillingness to take sides between reds and whites. Does this not reflect the kind of illiberal and anti-democratic consensus that helps to uphold the Putin regime? It now relies in public discussion on the ideological airs of Stalinism and of the whites to justify an authoritarian rule and to project an anti-Western, illiberal, and ironically anti-revolutionary message. So my question is, what do you think, regardless of choosing sides about whether reds or whites were the heroes or the villains, what do you think will be the message that the Putin regime will be projecting to its population about the revolution during the coming year?
Well, my sense is that they're projecting a non-message, and that this is in part because, not only because Putin may have a divided mind himself, but he probably reads the opinion polls. And there are these more or less independently conducted opinion polls which show, when they're asked about attitude to the Bolsheviks into 1917, a very solid group of about a third to a quarter to a third rather, says they're pro-Bolshevik, and a very solid group says they're pro-white. In other words, they're strongly anti-Bolshevik. And a lot of people in the middle say that they would just have tried to survive or would have emigrated or whatever. In other words, they don't want to be on either side. But those two partisan views are strongly held. And I think that is a part of the Putin government's problem of not wishing to gratuitously offend either one of them. Do you have another?
I agree. I mean, Robert has written a book about what he calls the preventive counter-revolution in Putin's Russia, and I see very much the historical debate or the politics of history of the government as part of that, as a cultural extension of this preventive counter-revolution. So hoping to not have what happened in Ukraine and so on. But and what works really well for that is the Second World War, because a large section of the public can agree that this was an achievement and that this was, in the end, as horrible and so on as it was, in the end that was a good thing, that Nazism was defeated. And that one can be proud of that. So there's, and opinion polling shows that very clearly. So that's a quite easy bet. Not that they're totally cynical, because I think they believe what they're saying as well. But this works as a political mobilization tool. A revolution doesn't, for the reasons Sheila has mentioned, and also because they don't really want a revolution, right? So it's best not to have a revolution. But you have the problem that this is the revolution which sets up the state, which then wins the war against Germany. So you can't actually ignore the revolution either. So they're in a terrible situation with this revolution. So it's best to leave it to the scholars, because they don't do any harm, right? We had here a question, please.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Now, I'd like you to make a comment about the influence of the revolution in America, but if I can preface that by, or adding to it, by a remark made to me by somebody who was an academic in America, started Melbourne University the same day that you did, and also trained as a priest, briefly. He said to me in 92, significant time, 92, that the most admired political leader in America amongst intellectuals was Fidel Castro. of course, he was talking about South America. Now, would you like to make any comment about
Castro?
how the revolution affected South America?
Oh, goodness. You know, I feel, I mean, clearly it was an inspiration to many in South and of course, Central America too, the Mexican Revolution. But I feel there's not a great deal that I can tell you more after I've gone to the conference in Chile, which is in May. I think it's May. Anyway, whenever, because I'm hoping that after that I will know all about how it affected Latin America.
I think there was another hand up in here. Yes.
Hi, Sheila. I was just wondering if you think it would have been feasible for a revolution-style uprising to have occurred from the peasant class of Russia instead of the working class, more in the style of the Chinese Revolution, if the late 19th, early 20th century industrialization of Russia hadn't occurred.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, the Marxist answer on that is peasants are, you know, incapable of organization and so on, although they...
A sack of potatoes. Marx called them a sack of potatoes.
Yeah.
Potatoes in a sack.
Right. But in Russia, I mean, the political representative was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and they had lots of support. And I think I would say that perhaps with different kind of leadership, you know, they could have got in instead of the Bolsheviks. But that's as far. I haven't explored that what if question really further than that.
I think there was a hand up in the middle here. No. Yes.
You first?
Yeah. Okay, you first, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Brandon from Trobe. Thank you for coming here, and I was actually curious of your opinions on whether or not the actions of Russia with Ukraine currently at the moment is any signs of maybe a subtle rebuilding of the Soviet Union, or potentially even encouraging revolution in other countries in more favor towards the Russian opinion or the Russian economy at this point.
I wouldn't see it in a context of encouraging revolution in other countries, in that I think it is very specific to regions that used to be part of the Soviet Union and are now not a part of Russia. So I wouldn't put it in a revolutionary context. You know, how far there is in Ukraine there is the West and the East division, which and including demographic, was the Russian speakers. So it's a problem, and you could say it also constitutes an opportunity. Now, how far Putin is likely to push that, I feel that's outside of my competence to guess.
Time will tell, I think.
Thank you. Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom said that, written in the 30s, he said, I think with reference to the Soviet Union, one day the socialist revolution will fail and people will say it wasn't the system that was bad, it was the leaders. But his insight was that it was inevitable that the leaders would be despotic, that they would all come through the secret police, and they would have because of their inclination and their background, they would have no qualms about imposing a totalitarian system on people and do that in a very malevolent fashion. I read that some 20 or 30 years ago. I thought this seemed an amazing insight to me. Do you think that was indeed the case? Did it indeed transpire that way?
That it was bound to produce an oppressive system, that the revolution in Russia was bound to produce an oppressive system? Yeah. Well, I think it's you know, it's one of the aspects of revolutions that when you unleash violence, it both is very difficult to calm it down, and those in power have developed a taste for it, or rather, perhaps a taste for it, but also it becomes the way that they know to solve problems, the only way that they know to solve problems. When I looked at the at Soviet, the mechanisms of Soviet rule in the first decades after the revolution, I'm struck by how difficult they found it to get across any of their policies. They can say, well, we got a policy to do X and Y, but then, nothing happens. So they think, well, what do we do? So, okay, there must be somebody who's preventing this happening, so let's use violence against them and maybe things will be better. In other words, there's a sort of mechanism, a reinforcing mechanism. The less effective you are, the less your administrative capacity is, the more violence, especially if you're coming out of a revolutionary situation, may seem to be the answer. Now, the question is, how long does that go on? When do you start to pull back from the violence and say, okay, now we've got a stable society, now we don't have to use violence anymore? That took a long time in the Soviet Union. I guess you could say it's 1953 that they start saying that, and it takes a while to get in. So there's a long period there.
Question from?
Two short questions, if I may, based on recent debates in historiography. A few weeks ago, Boris Kolonitsky, the foremost Russian historian of the February Revolution, was interviewed and asked why the revolution happened in Russia, of all countries, and not in a more advanced country. And his tentative reply was that the main reason was the Tsarist regime's intransigent attitude towards managing social strife. And if you look at France, for example, which had at least as much contention at the time, you find a much more conciliatory attitude on the part of the authorities, not just the central authorities, but also the local ones, which would also explain why so much violence and intransigence after the revolution was carried over into the new Russian system. I was wondering what you thought of that. And the second question is that you mentioned two candidates for the title of founding event of kind of contemporary Russian society, the revolution and the Great Patriotic War. But another one would be, as someone that's like Stephen Lovell has argued, not an event at all, but a process, namely urbanization, which by the second half of the 1960s had produced essentially a completely new society whose links with sort of the preceding decades, in a sense, were tenuous because so many people who became dominant in late Soviet society were kind of recent transplants, or the children of recent transplants to the big cities. And that would also explain the contemporary attitude towards the revolution, because people from my generation, certainly, and even my parents' generation from Russia, see the revolution, most of them who are not professional historians, through the lens of kind of late Soviet films about it and things like that. So what do you think of that perspective on the filters through which we now view the revolution?
Mm-hmm. Now, the Kolonitsky, the revolution, the result of incompetence of the late Tsarist regime. Yes, that does make sense to me. I mean, there's a very great unwillingness to on the part of the Tsar and his ministers to cooperate with the forces of society, which, especially during the war, are offering themselves as offering their support in running the country, and so there's a yes, it's a very rigid attitude that Nicholas, in particular, brings to that question. So yes, I would go along with that. Now that question about urbanization. When you look at what the Bolsheviks thought their revolution was about, they say, well, what we have to do, and especially this is in the 1930s, but they're saying it before too, we have to build socialism, and building socialism is essentially an industrial modernization program. Now, an industrial modernization program combined with collectivization is going to have people coming out of the villages into towns in huge numbers. So, and that indeed happens. And from what is it, 80% rural at the time of the revolution, and sometime in the 60s it's a 50-50. So that huge demographic, you could say that's the thing to look at. At the same time, I wouldn't separate it wholly from the revolution. I mean, any kind of modernization would have produced this effect, but the Soviet modernization was very much, Soviet transformation policies were very much involved in that process. So I think that to talk about it as a demographic process, which is in some way separate from the political regime, is in a way a bit misleading.
There could be another founding event, right, which is 1991, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, which could be, seen as, a decolonizing event and the moment when the Russian nation state was born. But that would require
You can't afford because you've got to have the Second World War.
Well, you could probably deal with the Second World War in some way, but that would require to get rid of all kind of nostalgia about the great empire and so on, and that's not. And it has been also experienced by so many people as a utterly negative decade after 91 for many that would be very hard to sell probably to. In the back is a hand up. Take maybe this question and maybe two more, and then one more. Okay, one more and then stop. So you're the second to last question.
Yes.
Questioner.
Cool. Hello. I will firstly say, very, very interesting conversation. You helped me quite a lot with my studies because I'm doing VCE Year 12 at the moment. And I was just curious, as we kind of get further and further away from the revolution, and I was just wondering if, in the future, the kind of we could kind of see this rebirth in kind of a Leninist and Marxist ideology, especially because I've been noticing, especially among young people, especially among my friends, that there's a more positive view when it comes to people like Lenin, and as you've mentioned before, with quoting Trotsky, that there is a river of blood between Lenin and Stalin. And I do notice that, especially amongst those that would kind of view kind of communism and those kind of social ideas as being really, really kind of good, that it's, Lenin was the good one and Stalin was the bad one and all the problems with Stalin, and if you remove Stalin out of the equation, the revolution would have gone fine. I'm not saying that's the case, but I do think that there are some people who would view it like that. And I'm just curious if you think that we could maybe see a resurgence in this kind of socialist, communist, Leninist kind of ideology or Marxist in the future.
We might have declared the revolution dead too early.
No, of course they can't. Who can? I mean, you never know what may resurge, and it certainly could do so. I've read such. There are a lot of books have come out about the revolution this year and are coming out, including from the left and from the radical left, like China Miéville's book called October. And I was very interested to see to what degree they take their stand on Lenin and socialism and how they handle it. I was struck by the minimalism of their argument. Miéville, for example, he basically says, and Žižek is the same, Slavoj Žižek, we should take notice of the revolution and learn its lesson, because its lesson is that you can always revolt against things and break them, and something will happen. And sort of the Leninist way of thinking about something will happen is to have a very acute sense of where the opportunity is and to jump on it. Now that struck me as a really minimalist claim. In other words, not saying the revolution gave us an example of socialism which maybe didn't work, but still it gave us, no, just saying we shouldn't remove revolution from the repertoire, because sometimes to break things is good and necessary.
Last question.
Hi, just to bring it back home and away from Russia, I'd be really interested in your comment about the effect of the Russian Revolution on Australia. And in particular, we have in this state, and you said, Sheila, you were still in Australia till 1964, we had, of course, a very negative impact of Santa Maria's movement in the Labor Party and our purge, which meant that the Labor Party was kept out of office for decades. There were effects of the Russian Revolution and communism in Australia, but I'd like to know what you two think of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know how far I'd say that was actually the revolution. In other words, it was extremely important in Australian politics, the fear of communism, including of Soviet communism. Now, how much when people were afraid of that, they were thinking specifically of the revolution. Of course, it was talk about expansion of export of revolution and so on, but it seems to me it came down to an intense fear of the Soviet Union as a hostile power, which, of course, as you point out, had enormous consequences for Australian politics.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up here. Thank you all for coming. We were very flattered that that we didn't only fill this room, but another one as well. And I take this as a sign of things to come when I'm moving here permanently in July.
Thank you to the speakers. It wouldn't be appropriate if we let our speakers go without a more formal vote of thanks. And my name is Chris Mackey from La Trobe University, and I've been involved in helping to set up this. Just make the point before we go that La Trobe, as Professor Dewar mentioned, is 50 years this year. And it's often said that La Trobe is probably the most radical university in Australia's history. I certainly remember it when I was a student, the La Trobe Wardell Road marches and so forth. So in some ways it's really appropriate that we're celebrating both the centenary of the Russian Revolution and La Trobe's early history at the same time. But I feel tonight we've also had another celebration, and that is the celebration of Sheila's work on the Russian Revolution. And I think we're really privileged tonight to have heard not just one, but two professors of great distinction sharing their knowledge with us tonight. So I'd be really grateful if you could thank them for that privilege. And thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.